My name is Kevin Rudd. I am the chair of the International Peace Institute in New York. I'm also president of the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. Both of our institutions, the IPI and the Asia Society, are joining in today's event in order to examine one question which has been debated much in the international community over the last several months. And that is the role of multilateral institutions in dealing with the current COVID-19 crisis. The bottom line for all of us, wherever we come from in the world, is that global pandemics are the very essence of the reason why we have a multilateral system of global governance. And we know the reason for that, and that is because epidemics and pandemics are no respecters of international borders. In that sense, the challenges of nature in particular, like the great global challenge of climate change, have long told the international community that in fact these challenges transcend all of our national boundaries. And furthermore, that the actions of each and every one of us within our national boundaries impacts our neighbours directly. On the question of climate change, for example, we may act in terms of bringing down carbon emissions, but sometimes our neighbours may not act. But the planet ultimately does not lie. And the cumulative impact of ultimate aggregation of greenhouse gas emissions has an impact on the planet at large, including all countries within it. And so it is too with epidemics and in particular pandemics, because once again, this is a phenomenon which knows no limitations by artificially imposed national borders and national boundaries. This COVID-19 crisis, you'll all be aware, has tested not just our institutions of national governance around the world, but have truly tested our systems of global governance as well. Within our national systems of government, we all have national notification systems which seek to bring information from any outbreak of diseases at the local level immediately to the national level and immediately onto the World Health Organization in Geneva for further notification to the world at large. That is the system which we have created in order to deal with pandemics and with epidemics. And all that exists under the treaty we agreed to as a community of states back in 1948 when we brought the World Health Organization into being. And under the World Health Organization, we've also brought into being what is called the International Health Regulations. And under those international health regulations, we all have obligations and responsibilities to each other in terms of how we deal with any disease outbreak within our national boundaries. The World Health Organization and the international health regulations fit within a wider fabric of the institutions of global governance. And that brings us back to the entire fabric of international law, anchored ultimately in the United Nations Charter and the United Nations Organization. And that brings us to our special guest who is with us for this discussion today. Personally, I'm delighted that the President of the United Nations General Assembly, His Excellency Tijjani Muhammad-Bande from Nigeria, has found time to join us for this important discussion. And I look very much forward to what His Excellency has to say to our gathering as we seek to prise open this important discussion about the future of multilateralism in handling the COVID-19 crisis and the future of multilateralism more broadly. His Excellency has been an active President of the UN General Assembly and therefore is an excellent position to understand full well what the General Assembly has been doing in this area, but also what the other institutions of the United Nations have been doing in this area since this outbreak has impacted on the world at large, both in public health and in our economies over the course of the last 3 months or more. Our format today is very simple. I'm going to, in a minute, ask His Excellency to make some formal remarks to our gathering, and when he's concluded, I will then engage him in a number of questions of my own, before then turning to the questions which you, in our viewing audience, in our participating audience, have chosen to raise. And so what I'd like to do now is turn immediately to His Excellency. His Excellency comes from the wonderful country of Nigeria, a major country in Africa, and Africa, both as nation states and through the agency of the African Union, has become a major voice in the institutions of global affairs and in the institutions of global governance as well. And of course, epidemics and pandemics are no stranger to the continent. We're familiar in particular with how the continent has been afflicted with pandemics in the past. And so, His Excellency, Tijjani Muhammad-Bande, I now turn to you for your formal remarks, and when you're concluded, I will then get on to a more general Q&A session. Over to you, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. Honorable Kevin Rodd, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I thank IPI for organizing this important conversation, even at a time the world is facing an unprecedented threat from the rapidly evolving COVID-19 pandemic. My sincere condolences to those who have lost loved ones, and I wish those suffering from the disease a quick recovery. I'm grateful to healthcare workers and those on the front line combating this disease, thereby keeping our communities safe and healthy. I commend member states, the World Health Organization, civil society organizations, and the private sector for providing vital support and services in the fight to defeat the pandemic. In the face of mounting challenges, we are reminded of the indispensability of the United Nations and of multilateral institutions more broadly. The United Nations has provided from the onset a forum to challenge this pandemic in a coordinated way. We must thus continue to support the World Health Organization to overcome this challenge and prevent future pandemics. As we commemorate the second International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace, we must stay true to the founding ideals of our organization and continue to work within the framework of the United Nations Charter for international peace and security, the rule of law, justice, and sustainable development, particularly in the most difficult of times. The primary responsibility of the United Nations is the maintenance of international peace and security. Unfortunately, in the midst of the ongoing crisis, there are too many countries experiencing protracted violent armed conflict. I call on all countries and parties to conflict to support the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire and to strengthen international coordination to create conditions for dialogue and ensure access to food and essential health supplies to those in need during this trying period. Excellencies, distinguished participants, COVID-19 has disrupted billions of lives with far-reaching effects on the health and livelihoods of people. Already, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, has forecast a global recession. The International Labour Organization projects that workers will lose as much as $3.4 trillion in income by the end of 2020. Global health systems are under enormous stress and global travel have been severely impacted. States, corporations, and families are already counting losses that could only be imagined in a state of war. Developing countries will be the hardest hit by the ongoing health and economic crisis. In addition, this crisis comes as we embark on the decade of action and delivery to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. We risk losing the gains made in achieving the SDGs. Now, more than ever before, we must remain steadfast in achieving the SDGs by following through on our commitment under the Addis Ababa Action Agenda for Financing for Development to build resilience and prevent inequalities from deepening. We must safeguard those most vulnerable, those who are often marginalized, children, the elderly, and people with disabilities, and in particular, women who are disproportionately affected. We must galvanize multilateral action now to build resilient health systems, protect gains made in the eradication of poverty and zero hunger, and ensure we uphold our commitment to leave no one behind. We must also implement a structured response to mitigate the disruption in education, as 180 countries have mandated school closures, affecting more than 1.5 billion youth and children, with many lacking the connectivity required to continue education through ICT-based distance learning. Ladies and gentlemen, combating COVID-19 is a collective responsibility. Together, we must fight stigma, discrimination, and xenophobia, and halt the spread of fear and hate. Individual actions have a direct impact on protecting lives and ending the pandemic. I urge everyone to follow the advice of the World Health Organization. We must adhere to social distancing, wash our hands, and look out for one another. This is how we show solidarity and uphold multilateralism. I call on member states and all those who have the capacity to financially support the United Nations COVID-19 Global Humanitarian Response Plan to do so. I'm glad a lot of countries have already answered this call. This is really, really what we expect. And I join all of you in thanking them and urge others to follow suit. The founders of the United Nations chose hope over cynicism, empathy over indifference, and partnership over distrust. In this 75th year of our organization, we must remain true to these ideals. Just as we have overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges in the past, we'll also overcome this together. I thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Your Excellency, for those opening remarks. You reminded us at the very beginning of your remarks about the human dimensions of this crisis, and that is that COVID-19 may sound like a technical, scientific and medical term, but the bottom line is it affects radically people's lives, and tragically many lives have been lost, just as it affects radically so many human livelihoods, as so many jobs are being lost. I would like, if it's acceptable to you, Excellency, if you do reflect in particular where you yourself see this crisis beginning to unfold across Africa, across emerging economies and countries in South Asia and Latin America, in Asia and the Pacific. When this crisis first broke out, Your Excellency, sometime in late February, I wrote in the international media that China's January and February would become the rest of the world's March and April. And unfortunately, since then, that has proven to be the case. And this massive second wave effect we have seen in countries across North America and across various parts of Europe and elsewhere. But in terms of a further wave of effect at a large scale, of course, many of us are deeply concerned about what will unfold on the continent itself, the continent from which you come, but elsewhere in emerging economies and developing countries across the world. And so if I could begin by asking you, Your Excellency, for your own reflections on what you now see unfolding in your own continent, but elsewhere in the developing world from the COVID-19 crisis. Over to you, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think for us who know a bit about the continent, the worry is that given the already difficult situation countries in Africa and other countries similarly located in terms of income, the worry is big in terms of how health systems are already struggling, in terms of how the connections we have as Africa with other parts of the world in relation to medical supplies, in terms of vaccines, even in terms of training, and fragile as the health systems are. The crisis in the speed it is unfolding requires something completely new in terms of our ability as countries, as health systems, to step up. One, in giving information, and there is a differential. There are variations of that response. Some countries in Africa have had better ways of dealing with giving information during pandemics than others. You note, we have been through Ebola, we've been through some other kinds of pandemic, and some have found means, protocols of dealing with this. But in the context of falling price of commodities on which African countries depend, in the context of challenges to even countries that have been our traditional partners, this becomes even more critical. And then the real hope, of course, is that Africa understands, like the rest of the world, that this is not an African problem. This is truly a global problem, and which means we're able to learn from others, we're able to teach others, and more, there is no question that this is the moment, if ever there was one, that borders mean nothing when it comes to real serious crisis. And I think the continent, through its organs, the African Union and the various sub-regional bodies, are doing okay. But remember, the context is that of poverty. It is in many parts of the continent also conflict, which prior to this has already become really a problem. But yes, African countries are doing well. Some of them are doing better than others, and they are pulling together through the AU and also in relation to its relationships to other parts of the world. This is the way forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Your Excellency, for those remarks. You correctly pointed, in my own judgment, to not just the potential public health impact in Africa, but also the potential economic impact as well, which, given the enormous achievements in economic development in Africa over the course of the last decade, saddens many of our hearts about what the impact could be, given that we have seen in many countries incomes rising and prosperity levels rising, and a whole new business community emerging in the Pan-African economy. But yours is also a resilient continent and has come through challenges before. And therefore, there are lessons of resilience for you to pass on to the rest of the world at this most troubling time. Excellency, you're the President of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Could you also update us on what the UN General Assembly has been doing on the COVID-19 crisis? Other institutions such as the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, and also what the Secretary General himself has been doing in his own global leadership on what we do in turning the corner, and to use his term, building back better for the long term, when we look at long-term economic recovery and its impact on the global challenge of climate change. So your reflection on what the UN across the system has been doing so far, starting with the General Assembly, of which you are the distinguished president.
Thank you very much. I think as an assembly of 193 countries, I think we have not faced a challenge more urgent than this. We're unable to meet. We have been unable to meet for some time. We're not sure when next we can physically meet. And that is one. We have a tradition of arduous negotiations over all kinds of things. A normal day is a beehive of activity at the United Nations, openly and at times in hidden rooms. And now, clearly, we are unable to meet physically, and we have to first and foremost find means to connect to continue to do the work of the United Nations, because the United Nations does not close shop. Whatever the crisis, it has to work. And it has to use, through the authority of the Assembly, to make resolutions and decisions that are consequential. In doing this, one, what is clear is the resolve of member states and permanent representatives who represent them to continue to reach out to others within the Assembly, to have resolutions, to think of ways of still working even under this condition, and to send a sense of hope and can-do attitude as the only means to do so. And beyond simply having statements of solidarity, the Assembly, through a lot of members, has had to work through a number of decisions and resolutions to help galvanize action in relation to not only dealing with the immediate and current danger, but the fallout, which already is clear in terms of economic collapse, in terms of break in cohesion, and in terms of dealing with manifestations of hate in a period when this is certainly never welcome, but in particular this time. And again, I can see that one, this opportunity has also granted us, as a part of the United Nations, a principal organ, to work very, very closely with the Secretary General, with the Security Council, with the President of ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. Indeed, we had an unprecedented joint briefing to member states, organized by the Assembly and co-organized with the Secretariat, the Secretary General, President of the Security Council, President of ECOSOC. And you see, to show that the United Nations is working as one. And when the Secretary General called for global ceasefire, it was also something that we had also had the privilege of knowing was coming. It was something we encouraged. The fund established and the call to get funding to support efforts of countries that the Secretary General is leading is something we all share in. The Security Council is involved, we are involved, and countries within the system, whether you're talking the UK, Saudi Arabia, Norway, many countries are also working to give support to the funds that are so created. And I think for us, this is the only way to go. This is the only way to go. And I can say there are many other resolutions targeting particular requirements. Some resolutions are of support to the city of New York and to the state for its support to all of us. Some resolutions, some of the resolutions deal in particular with health systems support in terms of vaccines, if they are available. How are we to guarantee? We must remind others that vaccines, when developed, are not for countries alone, but they are for all of us. They must be affordable, available to all. This is important. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that reminder, Excellency. Many people in the international community sometimes forget about the actual physical location of the United Nations headquarters in the city of New York itself. And New York is the single most affected city in the world so far from this global pandemic. And so many of us feel for members of the UN family who are themselves directly affected each day by the unfolding impact of this crisis in New York. You also correctly remind us, Excellency, on the important question of vaccine development, that vaccines themselves should be seen in this context as a global public good, rather than a piece of singular national property. And from my own perspective, I could simply fully endorse your remarks there. What we do not want to see is this becoming an issue of national rivalries let alone using the development of the vaccine for a particular national advantage, given that this challenge, as you and I have both said in this discussion so far, transcends all national boundaries. So the whole notion of a vaccine as a global public good is, I think, central to the way in which this COVID-19 crisis evolves in the future across the international community. Excellency, when you became President of the General Assembly, you indicated that you wish to dedicate your presidency to the overall challenges of UN reform, and you also pointed to various elements of the UN system where you would like to see reforms made. Obviously, we all know that since the COVID-19 crisis has unfolded, is that there has been a very large debate internationally about the role and the future of the World Health Organization. What I would like to reflect on here, however, is the broader prospects of reform, positive reform, coming out of the current crisis. A few years ago, Your Excellency, when I was chair of the IPI's Independent Commission on Multilateralism, we also conducted a review of the WHO, as well as the lessons and learnings of the international community coming from the Ebola crisis. And many of those recommendations are contained in our reports of 2016 and 2017. But if I could ask you, Your Excellency, to reflect more broadly, given your deep experience of the UN General Assembly and the position of individual nation states, as to where you think the whole process will now go in terms of broader UN reform, including the machinery dealing with epidemics and pandemics. Over to you, sir.
I think several things. Thank you very much, Honorable Rod. I think one, reform is necessary for all living organisms, and so including social systems. And I think crisis moments provide us opportunities to reflect deeper. Our immediate focus should be to get over the situation as it is, and it is bad enough. We have to reserve our energy to focus on the immediate danger. Now, reform in relation to the United Nations relates to its ability to continue to be legitimate. I think without its legitimacy, nothing else will work. And we should make sure that it is for people, and people from all parts of the world must see it as theirs. And so how to structure our conversation and our actions to remind everyone that there was a reason why the system, why the organization was created. And more than ever before, it has become extremely pertinent that this is something all people understand. Now, therefore, we must continue to work to guarantee that all organs of the system enhance their legitimacy. But it's not just to be legitimate, they must also deliver, because there must be delivery for the legitimacy to continue. And in this delivery, we must deal with technical capacities, we must deal with financial resources, we must deal with, of course, training and all that. So the World Health Organization is what we have, and we have to have a body that is nimble enough, legitimate enough, and resourced enough to do not just the work of now, but to continue to scan the horizon, to have protocols that work. They work in all regions of the world and are connected in such a way that a pandemic is truly what it is. Once it is known there is a problem, all parts of the world know and prepare. I think this is the direction to go. It is certainly important that we resource whatever body looks after our health, and this is central to multilateralism. I think all organs of the system are under reform, including the General Assembly. The SG's reforms have advanced. The development system is better aligned, and the Assembly is also reforming its working methods. So these are the issues. The ECOSOC is also doing tremendous work to streamline its own work. I think this is just to make sure that there is not only value for money, but there is also legitimacy to support the work we do. Thank you very much.
Well, Excellency, you point to essential elements of the continued role of multilateral institutions and these two underpinning principles of legal legitimacy, which you've just pointed to. And in the case of the WHO, for example, the International Treaty of 1948, which gave rise to the institution. And the member states of the United Nations have assented to that treaty and participate in its ongoing governance through the World Health Assembly. And then over here, there's the second point that you make, which is the inherent legitimacy of an institution proceeding from its underpinning international legal instruments is one thing. The continued effectiveness and efficiency of that institution is another. And to be effective and efficient, an institution also has to be properly resourced. And of course, those of us who are friends of the United Nations system, like we at the IPI have been for half a century, and myself personally, a long-standing friend of the UN system, have looked with some despair at the declining allocated contributions, assigned contributions to the WHO, which have fallen over time. And therefore, the WHO has had to rely increasingly on voluntary contributions from individual states. And this of itself then creates a problem in terms of knowledge of long-term financial resourcing. But also, when you start to have the dominant part of funding coming from voluntary contributions, it then has an effect on the way in which the organisation does its business. Because obviously, those who make voluntary contributions will be saying to the WHO or to other institutions, here is a particular priority we wish to nationally pursue. So the points you raise about legitimacy and effectiveness are reinforcing, mutually reinforcing in terms of the ongoing integrity of the system. We're now turning to various questions that we have from those who have been tuning in to this broadcast. The first question I've got is from Akshita Nanda, who is from India, but is also at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. So Akshita, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be at the moment. But Akshita's question is this, Your Excellency, and I quote, what can the UN General Assembly do to ensure multilateral approaches to the current global pandemic? And especially, what can the UN General Assembly do when we see evidence of disagreement between the great powers? The question goes on to say, there is a danger that multilateralism loses its international standing over time, and what can the UN General Assembly do to reconstitute the international standing of the whole notion of multilateral governance? Over to you, Your Excellency, for that question from our friend from the National University of Singapore.
Well, thank you very much. I think we do need to work harder at reminding ourselves where we got to the United Nations as an organization, and to also imagine, as I often do myself, what kind of a world it would be were it not for the United Nations. I think there are limitations to the organization, like all other organizations, and like as we stated from the questions, from the reflection of Honorable Rad, we do need to connect legitimacy with effectiveness. But the United Nations, we need to do better in communicating what it is that we do. The meetings we do are important. They connect to individual lives. the achievement of 2015 in terms of Paris Accord and the Sustainable Development Goals are really monumental achievements in multilateralism. And I think if we should focus on these two, give it 20 years, I will bet we'll have a different world. There will be less conflict, there will be less hate, there will be more respect for rule of law, there will be more certainty of healthier life for other for coming generations. So I think this is there, but the challenges are huge. But I believe the resources are also available in terms of technical resources. We are better informed, there are obvious. The technology available. Now imagine we are talking, you probably are in India, I'm in New York, in Australia, around the world, we are seeing ourselves. This is really a new world. And with the technology available, we are, I think, better able to deal with the challenges as I imagine. But of course, poverty, illiteracy, and inequities stand in the way. I think technically we can address them. I think we should continue to work harder at it. I think I want you to, as a listener, have more faith in the system to give it the oxygen it needs to move on. And this oxygen also includes, of course, constructive criticism, without which we simply cannot make progress. I think as to the conflicts between what you say about nations, I think we are not one world. We don't have one world government. And the diversity of views, even as in within nations, is to be understood. But here's the thing. All countries have a platform at the United Nations. And I asked President of the General Assembly at its 74th session, I was very happy that up to 191 countries made statements during the opening session, meaning the platform is key, is alive and well. The debates are natural. We should allow them, but do them with respect, but also remind ourselves why the debates should be conducted. It's about people. It's about an interconnected world. Thank you very much.
Yes, Excellency, your comments about United Nations and the inherent powers which lie within the institution itself already, and the ability of nation states, if they agree, to draw upon those powers to a phenomenal extent to solve world problems, should not be underestimated. And for those who often criticize the UN to this extent to say that it is no longer relevant, the bottom line is, if the United Nations disappeared tomorrow, then the day after we'd be convening a meeting on reconvening and re-establishing a form of United Nations in the future. So the question is not the validity of the institutions. The question becomes a continuing and practical one of the extent to which political will exists across the United Nations family to use the institutions to their greatest and fullest extent. And your point about communications is so important. It's perhaps an unfortunate aspect of human nature that so much that is good done by the UN family every day, through institutions such as the World Food Programme, through UNICEF, and through the Food and Agricultural Organization and others, the UNHCR. Out there, tens of thousands of people delivering positive outcomes every day, but largely not communicated to the court of international public opinion. And as a result, these things tend to be just forgotten or ignored, or even worse, not known. And instead, focus is brought to bear purely on where there are evidences of lacks within the system. Another question, Excellency, comes from Mr. Ng Jong-yi, again from Singapore. Singapore, obviously, is a centre of great interest in this COVID-19 crisis, as being one of the countries first affected. and where the government continues to wrestle the challenge to the ground. But the question from Mr. Ung is, do you think that some of the devastating effects of this pandemic will in fact push countries more towards multilateralism in the future or less? That, I think, is a question often being asked in the court of international public opinion today. Over to you again, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think Mr. An's question is an important one. I think what is playing out as I see it is really the pooling of resources, including ideas. And I think, I believe that what we are seeing is really the recognition that multilateralism is the way out. We do not have a national solution to COVID-19. This much is clear. Otherwise, we'd have our airlines flying as usual, we'd be traveling as we used to. This is no longer the case. I think what is playing out now is really proof that we get the point of our interconnectedness. So I am very confident that this moment will strengthen what we already know, our interconnectedness, including rights, including technology. And to the issue also raised, when we talk about United Nations, look at the contribution of United Nations to the end of apartheid, to the ending of colonial rule around the world. I think these are important, monumental things that can happen only with a body such as this one. Yes, I think, Mr. An, multilateralism is strengthening, not fraying, during this pandemic.
Again, I find myself in agreement with your remarks there, Excellency. Another question now from Judith Makaria, who's from Kenya, King's College, African Leadership Centre. And thank you, Judith, for your question, which is recognising the impact of the pandemic is different in different contexts. What does His Excellency think should be the next steps taken by the multilateral system to foster global development post-COVID-19? That is, what now happens, if I could paraphrase the question, to the future implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, which you noted before were one of the two big achievements of 2015, SDGs, as well as the Paris Treaty on Climate. Over to you again, Your Excellency.
But, thank you very much. I think Judith's question is important. I think I have remarked it. I think dealing with climate change and dealing with SDGs, I think these are the keys to it. Now, what we do need is really enlightened political will to get this done using a sense of the long term. I think post-COVID, this is simply a reminder that we got it right in Paris, we got it right in New York with the SDGs. Let us work not only as governments, and that is the point. The SDGs is not about governments, it's about everyone. Corporations, civil society, governments have a role, and they are key to the direction we take. I think this is the issue. We should have improvements in everything, and we should be interconnected. This is the issue. We should be sensitive to nature, without which the crisis we are witnessing in relation to global warming will continue. Yeah, thank you.
Good. We have a further question for the continent from Wadezo Rukato from South Africa, and again from the King's College African Leadership Centre. Thank you very much for the question. And it's one which goes particularly to the response to COVID-19 in Africa itself. And the question is, what is His Excellency's views on the coordination between the regional economic bodies in Africa, secondly, the African Union across the continent, and thirdly, the UN? how are these entities working effectively together in response to the COVID challenge on the continent? Over to you again, sir.
Yeah, I think this is really something that is just for us to note, that really the work Sarah is doing at UNECA is extremely fundamental in terms of working with the regional, sub-regional bodies, ECOWAS and others, to have a response. The United Nations Secretary General has a representative, the former Ghanaian foreign minister, that coordinates UN relationship with the AU, and this is done extremely well. Here in New York, he also has an advisor on African matters, just to tell you that Africa is really at the center of what the United Nations does. And therefore, we have in Sarah at UNECA in Addis a good coordinator working with another senior official of the UN at the AU headquarters. We have another senior African working here at the UN. So I think we have, with the UN development system reform, even more coordination that is happening. And therefore, there is a lot of reform that has taken place, which is already working. And I just want to assure the questioner that there is high-level coordination between the African Union Commission, His Excellency Faki will tell you, and Mr. Guterres. And this is really as it should be. And we urge that as a model also for others, similarly situated like Africa. There is a lot of coordination, there is a lot of effort to get resources, a lot of ideas are also being used. And African leaders are very creative. You read the statements of African leaders over how they reach out to citizens relating to the urgency of the moment, but also the connections beyond the moment that must be made. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you again, sir. We've got about 10 minutes left, and so I'll skip across a couple of questions here. We have one which relates to the role of the private sector in supporting and promoting the institutions of the multilateral system in dealing with COVID-19, particularly the role of the private sector actors at a time when some national institutions, or national governments, I should say, are becoming more nationalist in their allocation of resources. So your thoughts on that, sir, as well as a question we've got from David Salazar from Guatemala, who's a tech entrepreneur and director of Technology Center for Youth at Risk in Guatemala. And the question there is about the particular relevance of cities in developing countries in enhancing national resilience against the impacts of COVID-19. So one question, sir, is to do with the role of the private sector in militating against nationalism by national governments. And the second is, what can the international institutions do to support the resilience of cities in developing countries? When I think of cities, sir, I think of Lagos in your own country. Now, there's a city. That's a big city. And you'd have first-hand familiarity with the challenges of resilience of the city like that. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much. I think two things. One is that cities are often led by extremely smart people. To win an election, I'm not a politician in a city, requires a lot of skill, including and especially getting people to work together. In New York, now, because it's also a city, and this is where I live now, you see the work of the mayor on a daily basis. You also see the effort of people like Bloomberg to give support. This is just to cross over to the other question. And what you see is that citizens in different ways are coming on board. There are philanthropic organizations that are doing well in support of efforts. And it is the same. In Nigeria, over 100 billion has been raised through effort of the private sector, because that's in Naira. They also see this as their fight. Companies are given support. Individuals in villages are giving support. So it's not just the rich, but everyone is stepping up. Now, if any governments are slow, I don't think that I don't see that as the issue now. I think everyone has seen citizens and companies coming up on board. But the main thing is really to focus on those who are given the leadership to do the work needed. Again, a postmortem in the middle of a crisis is not a very productive way of addressing issues. I think the issue is that we are on a path that is working. Let us push in that direction. So yes, cities are supporting themselves. There are more challenges in cities because of their design in terms of their numbers. Cities are therefore a challenge because of the spatial element relating to cities and movements. Some are better designed and some are better resourced to deal with this. Certainly, Lagos will respond differently from New York. Both are mega cities. Each will connect to its ecosystem in terms of what are the hospitals like, in terms of what are the local regulations aside. Lagos is doing extremely well. It is now in Nigeria. Lagos is the model for looking after patients, and I think South Africa is doing well. I have information from Egypt everywhere, from Morocco, from Algeria, everywhere. There are leaders stepping up, and that is the way to do it. Now, private sector is key, and the private sector is doing extremely well in many parts of the world. And I think I'll leave it at this, just in the interest of time. Thank you.
That's a very important comment, Excellency. You're right to reflect, for example, on the contributions of people like Mayor Bloomberg and his particular emphasis on the role of cities around the world in dealing with the challenge of climate change. And yes, cities are subnational governments, and we, through the United Nations system, we deal with national governments, but the role of municipal governments and provincial governments is critical in delivering right across the fabric of the Sustainable Development Goals. It was my privilege last year to spend some time with the Mayor of Lagos, and I can't remember if the title is Mayor or Governor of Lagos, but it's a big place, as you know. It was a meeting with the President of your country, and if we're not dealing effectively with either pandemics or climate change at the municipal level for these large cities, then frankly, what national governments do becomes progressively irrelevant. So these are major engine rooms for effective change and for effective management of crises and for transformation. Which brings me to the last question we have from our listening audience, again, from friends in Guatemala, and David Salazar. It's an important question, Excellency, which goes back to something you said at the very beginning of the session, near the beginning of the session, about the role of technology. And that is, when we are looking at the future of the multilateral system, we often think that it's the same reality as it was in 1945. Whereas the truth is, technologies across the board have both complicated our lives as well as simplified our lives over that period of time, leaving to one side the distribution of those technologies in a fair and equitable way across the world. So the question from David Salazar is, can the pandemic be seen as an opportunity to modernize infrastructure systems across the world? For example, increasing services for online banking, for online education, addressing climate change, etc. In other words, a new conceptual approach to delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so your thoughts on that, Excellency?
Yeah, I think, thank you very much. I think it's a very important question. It raises huge issues. One, in terms of opportunity, in terms of what is possible, in terms of teaching, in terms of health, in terms of provision of services, in an array of fields, including agriculture. And now, the issue is simply, this is clear. We are meeting in a virtual room, in a virtual hall. around the world. This is great. Of course, there are advantages to in-person meetings. Obviously, we're human beings. But the other element, this human connection is important beyond simply technology. But the other connection is the real issue of differences. Some countries have serious challenges with technology. And if we are to talk of an equitable world, there are certain basics relating to technology that we must guarantee. And we should find means of supporting basic infrastructure in terms of technology for a lot of countries. Many African children are unable to learn properly during this lockdown. And this is not the situation with their counterparts in some parts of the world. And I think these are the issues. You want a world in which no one is left behind. Technology can help to quickly lift people out of poverty, to connect people, to give them education, to have better health outcomes. But it also can, if not taken seriously in terms of access, create huge problems for our world. I think we should work harder to prevent that from happening while using technology to the best possible means.
Thank you again, sir. It strikes me that we have a remarkable opportunity coming out of this crisis, bearing in mind our collective obligations to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, that the opportunity and the challenge of closing the global digital divide is a huge transformational time. And that is, if we close the digital divide within countries and between countries, given that digital platforms now represent such enormous opportunities for financial services, for education services, and for online health services, that it becomes this potentially turbocharging mechanism for the realization of the SDGs. And you, sir, will know well from the continent the extraordinary proliferation of mobile phone technologies across Africa, and the new deployments which are possible through the application of those mobile phone systems and other technology systems on basic things like how we manage the future of financial inequality across so much of the developing world as well. Well, friends, I'm conscious of the time, and we have reached the hour. And Your Excellency, you have been very generous with your time to spend with us and our online audience today. I think in New York, it's probably 10 o'clock in the morning. The only comfort I can give you, Your Excellency, is that it's midnight here in Australia. And given that it's just gone past midnight, I can assure you that tomorrow exists, because we've already seen it in Australia. So, and we therefore should have about us a general attitude of optimism for the future. As I close our session, I'd like to also, together with His Excellency, send a message to all those brave women and men working for the United Nations across the world today. So many of these heroic people are in dangerous situations, and in dangerous situations which pre-existed the COVID-19 crisis, and which the COVID-19 crisis has the potential to make doubly dangerous. Think, for example, of the millions of people around the world who are refugees, who are currently being cared for either by the UNHCR or by various of its partner organizations around the world, such as the International Rescue Committee. Now, these people on the ground dealing with the poorest of the poor are themselves now dealing with the reality of COVID-19 in a very practical way. So I would simply like to take this opportunity to extend on our collective behalf, the IPI, Asia Society, but also, if I could be so presumptuous, to speak on your behalf as well, Your Excellency as President of the UN General Assembly, to send our absolute best wishes and personal solidarity to all these brave women and men who are putting themselves literally in harm's way every day.
Thank you.
And for those who wish to review our conversation today with the President of the UN General Assembly, I'm advised that it will be available shortly via UN Web TV, as well as the websites and social media platforms of the International Peace Institute and of the Asia Society. We at the Asia Society are also running twice weekly online series on the impact of the coronavirus across Asia and across the world. To conclude our session, I would simply like to thank all who have joined us for today's session from around the world, and to you particularly, Your Excellency, His Excellency Tijjani Muhammad-Bande. We wish you well in what has turned out to be probably one of the most eventful periods to be President of the UN General Assembly. We wish you well in your efforts to bring together the international community, to harness women and men of goodwill, to bring about real results for the world. So we wish you Godspeed in all that you seek to do through this important institution.
Thank you. Thank you.
And good day, good morning, good evening to everybody across the world.